My name is Melissa Harper. I'm 32 years old, and until recently, I considered myself someone who had everything in life under control. I lived in Seattle, worked as an analyst at a large IT company, rented a bright apartment with a view of the bay, and believed that if you worked hard and tried to be a good person, life would definitely respond in kind. I was wrong. I met Daniel at a business forum in Portland. He was 4 years older than me, confident, calm, with that rare ability to listen as if you were the only one in the room. We started talking over coffee, then laughed together over a boring presentation, and by the end of the day, he knew I couldn't stand false motivation and dreamed of starting my own business someday. He seemed reliable to me, the kind of man with whom you wouldn't be afraid to build a future. Our romance developed rapidly. Daniel wrote me long messages in the mornings, came over late at night just to hug me, and was always there for me when work was draining me. 6 months later, we moved in together, and 8 months after that, he proposed, without fanfare, just over dinner, looking me straight in the eye. I said, yes, without hesitation. The wedding was modest but warm. No ostentatious extravagance. Just close friends, a few relatives, and the feeling that a new, proper life was beginning. I remember standing next to him, holding his hand, and thinking how incredibly lucky I was. The first warning signs came later, but I didn't pay them any mind at the time. After the wedding, Daniel insisted that we visit his parents more often. They lived in a small town in Ohio, in an old house that had long been in need of renovation. His father, Robert, was taciturn but polite, and his mother, Linda, seemed kind-hearted, slightly world-weary. They talked a lot about how difficult retirement was for them, how everything was getting more expensive, how difficult it was to cope alone. I sympathized. Even more, I wanted to help. One evening, after we'd already returned to Seattle, Daniel spoke cautiously, as if he'd been dreading my answer. He said he was worried about his parents, that the house was old, his health wasn't what it used to be, and that it was hard for him to live peacefully knowing they were alone there. Then he proposed an idea, moving in with them temporarily, renovating, and dividing the house into two parts so everyone could have their own space. I doubted it. It would mean a change in lifestyle, traveling, working remotely, responsibility. But I loved him and wanted to be a good wife. When he admitted that his parents were seriously in debt, almost $100,000, I felt uneasy. I asked him why he hadn't told me earlier. He replied that he didn't want to scare me. I remained silent again. We agreed that the expenses would be shared, that he would contribute financially, and that it would be temporary. I agreed to invest my savings, money I had saved for years, denying myself many things. I told myself that this was family, that this was how it was supposed to be. The move was the beginning of my slow awakening. The house turned out to be worse than I expected. The renovations dragged on, the estimates grew, the contractors demanded advance payments. I took on the organization, the bookkeeping, the negotiations. Daniel increasingly talked about problems at work, that his bonus had been delayed, and that he would make up his share later. But later never came. I worked nights, called the workers during the day, transferred money, counted, recounted, and paid again. His parents gradually stopped feigning gratitude. Linda allowed herself caustic comments, and Robert increasingly pretended I didn't exist. Sometimes I caught their glances evaluating cold. One day, I returned home earlier than usual. I heard voices coming from the kitchen. I hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but I stopped when I heard my name.
They were talking about debts.
About the house. About how she's not going anywhere anyway. When I walked in, the conversation stopped abruptly. Everyone was smiling, but the air was tense. Daniel avoided my gaze. From that day on, I began to notice more. Strange transfers from our accounts. His irritation when I asked questions. His mother's jokes about some women being too self-important. And most importantly, the feeling that I wasn't considered a person here but a resource. I didn't make a scene. I began to observe. I checked the documents. I started recording payments. I secretly consulted with a lawyer in Seattle. I opened a separate account. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to consider that maybe this marriage had been a mistake. The climax came suddenly, but I was prepared for it. That evening, Daniel said it almost casually. That he'd met another woman. That he was tired. That I would be better off living with his parents. They just needed help. That they could manage without me. He spoke calmly, almost indifferently. And I suddenly felt a strange calm. Because by that moment I already knew. The house, the debts, and their plans no longer belonged to me. But I don't belong to them anymore. After that evening, when Daniel told me of his decision as casually as people announce a change in their cell phone plan, I sat in the bedroom for a long time without turning on the light. The house was unusually quiet. Daniel's parents had gone to the neighbors, and he had locked himself in his office, pretending to work. No one asked how I was feeling, and in that silence, I suddenly realized clearly. I had been gone for a long time. Only a function remained. I didn't cry. Tears would have been a luxury I couldn't afford. Instead, I mentally reviewed everything I'd done in the past few months. Every payment, every transfer, every signature on a document. I recalled conversations with a lawyer, his calm voice, and his words about how in America, paperwork matters more than emotions. Then, for the first time, I thanked myself for being careful. The next morning, I got up before everyone else. I packed my laptop and documents and left the house without saying goodbye. I ordered a black coffee at a nearby cafe and opened my email. My email to the lawyer was short. "We're getting started." A reply arrived 20 minutes later. He wrote that the documents were ready, that everything would move quickly if I acted without hesitation. I returned to the house a changed person. Daniel was waiting for me in the living room. He looked tense, as if expecting hysteria, tears, and pleas. Instead, I calmly informed him that I had filed for divorce and that he must vacate the house within the legally prescribed time. At first, he didn't understand. Then he laughed, loudly, hesitantly. And then his face changed when I placed copies of the documents on the table. The house was indeed registered in my name. The debts, too. But with one caveat. I was the only one paying them, and this was recorded. His parents, who had come out of their room at the noise, were first indignant, then threatened, and then began pleading. Linda wept, accusing me of ingratitude. Robert spoke of betrayal. I listened and felt nothing. The lawyer insisted that I move out temporarily for safety and psychological comfort. I rented a small apartment in Denver, a city where no one knew me and where I had no memories. There, for the first time in a long time, I slept well. There, I allowed myself slow breakfasts, aimless walks, and thoughts not of who I owed, but of what I wanted. The divorce process turned out to be messier than I expected. Daniel tried to negotiate, then threatened, then begged again. His new girlfriend texted me several times, first with arrogant sympathy, then with outright anger. I didn't respond. My response was action. The court hearing lasted several hours. I spoke calmly, without accusations, simply stating the facts. The judge asked questions, reviewed documents, clarified dates. Daniel looked lost. His arguments crumbled like a house of cards. My parents sat with their heads bowed. When the decision was announced, I felt not joy but relief. It was as if a heavy backpack I'd been carrying for years had finally been lifted. The house was put up for sale. I'd made back most of my investment. The rest was symbolic payment for a lesson I'd learned too late, but forever. I returned to work. My boss offered me a new project, complex, risky, but promising. I accepted without hesitation. For the first time in a long time, I made decisions without regard for other people's expectations. A few months passed. My life became quieter, but deeper. I signed up for a software architecture course, not because I had to, but because I was interested. I started running in the mornings not for the form, but for the feeling of movement. I learned to be alone and not feel lonely. One day, I received a letter from Daniel. It was a paper letter with uneven handwriting. He wrote of remorse, of having lost more than he realized, of his regrets. I read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and put it away. I decided to reply later. Or never. The past no longer had power over me. In the spring, I invested in a small tech startup. It was risky, but my intuition told me I was making the right move. The project grew, the team was passionate, and I felt part of something alive, something real. Sometimes, sitting by the window in the evening, I remembered that version of myself, the woman who wanted to be convenient, useful, needed. I didn't despise her. I thanked her, because she was the one who brought me here. My story isn't about revenge. It's about boundaries. About that moment when you stop being a backdrop in someone else's life and become the protagonist in your own. And now, when the unknown lies ahead, I look at it without fear. Because I know, even if they try to use me again, I already know how to leave in time.